Okay, welcome everyone to the book launch and celebration of Doug Hunter. It is our honor and privilege to gather today on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis, and is today home to many Indigenous people from around the world. In gathering here today, we acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and that this territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now today, we are gathered here to celebrate the recent publication of two books by one of our own, York University PhD graduate Doug Hunter. Dr. Hunter is a historian, a journalist, and an author who has written, by my best estimate, more than 20 books, though there might be a few that I missed in between. And on topics ranging from Tim Horton, the hockey star, to Tim Hortons, the iconic Canadian restaurant chain. You can see a wide breadth of experiences here. He's also written on John Molson, Samuel du Champlain, Henry Hudson, John Cabot, and Christopher Columbus, and even the bankruptcy of the telecom giant Nortel, which resulted, of course, in the largest bankruptcy case in Canadian history, as well as many, many other topics. Dr. Hunter is a writer who knows how to tell a riveting story with extraordinary clarity and an eye for exceptional detail. His books are deeply researched and immersed in the archive while also being expertly paced and beautifully rendered. And this ability to weave together both story with the deep corners of the archive and an eye towards the larger historical forces that shape our world are well illustrated by the two books we are here to discuss today. The Place of Stone, Dighton Rock and the Erasure of America's Indigenous Past, University of North Carolina Press, 2007, and Beardmore, the Viking Hoax that rewrote history, McGill-Queen's University Press, 2018. So Doug, I was wondering if you might not start off by telling us a little bit about each of these books and the stories they tell.
Well, the Dighton Rock book, The Place of Stone, evolved, and it did evolve from my doctoral dissertation, which I did under Carolyn, Stone of Power. And I changed the title deliberately because you do want the book version to be a progression from the doctoral version. I also told that if I called it the Stone of Power, there would have to be a Viking with a sword with a lightning bolt coming out of the sky, and otherwise it just wouldn't work. So it was an interesting process for me, who had written extensively for the trade, to do an academic book for the first time. And I already understood going in that a dissertation is not a book. Dissertation has different objectives. You are going to do, there are certain things you're going to accomplish with it and demonstrate, knowledge of the, of the field and sources and whatnot. I did feel I'd written a fairly readable dissertation.
It was readable.
But I was fortunate that I went to the University of North Carolina Press and worked with editor Mark Simpson-Voss, because I don't think Mark's, let's say it's negative, he's not a historian. His background is actually in writing. I think that's his formal training.
Yeah, he did do an undergrad. Well, he started a PhD in ABD in American Studies.
But he talks so much as a writer. So, early in our conversations, I had this idea that, and I'm just giving you inside baseball on publishing first, is that I was going to just kind of clean up what I did. Take out the structural framing of, the introduction to the chapter and the conclusion. And very early on, Mark said to me that no, that I know you can write a book, and I'm expecting you to write a book, and I'm expecting you to go away and come back with a book for me. So that's actually what happened. In the process of condensing from 12 chapters to 10, I also did some more research over 2016 and around the ideas of white tribism, and I built that in. And so that book was around. So to get to the basis of that, what was that book? Well, when I came in and Carolyn said, you should do a PhD, and I hadn't been in school in 30 years, and I'd never done an MA, but I was brought in as sort of, advanced standing or something because of my other work. You needed a dissertation subject, and I think I came up with one in about an hour. And what I was interested in was pseudo-history and pseudo-archaeology. Because I'm out in the trade area of life. The really super fringy stuff is right off to Ancient Aliens to Templar Knights in the New World, all the stuff that's just kind of really popular but really weird and really not very true. And what interested me about it was how consistently pseudo-history tended to use and misappropriate Indigenous materials and Indigenous identities. So I started, and the more I looked into it, I had to refine it. Rock art was one of those places where you could consistently see people just misreading rock art all the time. And I think I had about 4 case studies, and there was just too many case studies. And what I decided in the end was I was going to pick one, and I picked Dighton rock. I picked Dighton rock because, unlike something like Peterborough petroglyphs, which really has a fascinating amount of misinterpretation, Peterborough wasn't known until into the mid-1950s, so all the history is fairly recent. But Dighton rock was first seen by colonialists right after King Philip's War. It was first seen in 1680, and it has just an infinite number of misinterpretations. It's been everything from Vikings to Egyptians to Phoenicians to, I mean, you name it. Whoever you think might have been in the New World, as they put it, then that's who Dighton rock was given to. And Stephen Williams, who wrote in Fantastic Archaeology, wrote about Dighton rock, and he said that if you look at Dighton rock at any period of time, you get a pretty good idea of what the prevailing archaeological ideas of the time were. And what I wanted to do was kind of go a step beyond that and say, if you look at Dighton rock at any point in time in its interpretation, you also get a very good idea of how Indigenous people were being interpreted. Because to give the rock to somebody else, you had to explain why Native Americans didn't make it. So it's a really interesting path through 300 plus years of, a lot of it is scientific archaeology, and a lot of it is mainstream thinking. It's not the fringy stuff. It's people in positions of authority and professors at Harvard, right up to, into the 20th century. So it's fringe, but in our mind now, but it actually was mainstream thought, very powerful thought and very influential thought. So that's why Dighton rock worked. And basically with Dighton rock in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, it may have been the most well-known archaeological artifact in America. Anybody that had an idea about who came to America had to deal with Dighton rock. Now it's just this thing in this little museum, and as I found when I wrote about it, people just had no idea what I was talking about. It has just faded off, and now it's this artifact of ideas about the past.
So Dighton rock as a kind of site for examining changing ideas about both the Indigenous and also the early settlement of North America. To help explain this process, you develop a term of what you term white tribism. Yeah. Can you explain what white tribism is?
Yeah, I learned early on and defied it that if you want to be hated in academia, invent terminology. But but I had to have a label for it. So I started to see this consistent pattern of how Indigenous existence is misrepresented and misappropriated. So white tribalism to me became the umbrella for Indigenous artifacts, Indigenous material culture, Indigenous bodies, Indigenous language that theorists, and they were mainly white Northern European theorists or colonialist theorists, would take and basically take away from them to say, no, this is not Indigenous in origin, this is evidence of Norse. In language, people would word hunt through Algonquian vocabularies and say, oh, these words are actually they're Portuguese in origin, or they're proof of Phoenicians. And rock art especially was always going to be a language written by somebody else other than them. Anytime, not always anytime, but often when scholars were looking at records of meetings with Indigenous people who seemed to be kind of, quote, civilized, polite, physically handsome by European standards, well, it had to be because the Europeans met them and changed them for the better. So any sign of a perceived advanced technology, that had to come from Europe as well. And we still kind of fall into that trap today. We've just gone through, and I don't think it was done maliciously, but we just went through the Dorset culture thing where there was Norse yarn up there, until finally there was an archaeological study just published this summer where somebody who was finally an expert in Norse yarn looked at it and said, this is nothing like Norse yarn. This is actually Dorset. Dorset people came up with this method of, creating this twine. So white tribism for me became how we take an indigenous in existence and we deny it and we erase that past. We just completely replace it with something that suits another theoretical objective. And often it comes up in Dighton Rock, one of the early ones from a Harvard professor, is what I call the too lazy and stupid theory, which really was Indians are just too lazy and stupid to make marks on rocks. And that's a prevailing wisdom you see through the analysis. And it's so lazy and stupid to me because they'd say, well, they didn't have iron tools, so how did they make the marks? Well, you don't make marks in rocks with iron tools. You make marks in rocks with a rock that's harder than the rock that you're carving, and it's called pecking. And if anybody had actually just gone to Dighton Rock and picked up another rock and banged on it, they could obviously see how you make the marks. But it was very easy sitting in Harvard, 30 miles away, to just say, too dumb, too lazy, no iron tools, couldn't have made this stuff. So let's give it to the Phoenicians. They're the popular go-to people right now.
So for a story that stretches across such a vast amount of time, there must be certain points that are perhaps turning points or moments of change in the way that people understood Dighton's Rock. So what are some of those major moments of change in the story of this place and this object?
I think one of the biggest ones was Antiquitates Americana, which was when it gave it to the Vikings, because that was one of the most influential books of the 19th century American history. Because on the one hand, from the upside, the Royal Northern Society of Antiquaries in Denmark, they were culminating a movement of more than a century that was saying, the Vinland sagas, there's some Irish mythology in there. There's one-legged unipeds running around and whatnot. But there is some kind of basic historical truth in here. And people began to accept that there really was a Thorfinn Karlsefni. There really was a Leif Erikson. And they really did come to a place called Vinland. So where is Vinland? So the downside of Antiquitates Americana is in searching for historical proof is they fixated on Dighton Rock and they turned it into an inscription by Thorfinn Karlsefni, which was really a borderline fraudulent effort. That fixated Dighton Rock for quite a few decades as to being, this is the Norse stuff. I think by the late 18th century, the shift had steadily moved away. It was being accepted as an indigenous artifact, which made it completely uninteresting because it was outside the bounds of history as history was understood. And it had influenced the rise of the idea of the mound builders theory and migration theories around who was here first. And there was a more sophisticated civilization that came first, and then the hordes showed up from Asia and wiped out the mound builders kind of thing. And that was starting to fade away too. And I think it would have stayed that way until Edmund Burke-Delabar, who was a professor at Brown University, who wrote 3 really good monographs on the historiography of Dighton Rock. And then in 1918, he drank the Kool-Aid. I mean, at the 11th hour, at the very end, he saw the date 1511 in a photograph, which no one had ever seen before. And then he decided he had to find somebody that fit it. And he came up with Miguel Corte Real, the lost expedition of the Portuguese, who somehow went missing. He went missing in 1502 somewhere. And then he just somehow got to. And then he created this whole elaborate scenario of how he became the leaders of the local Indians. And he was, again, it was that white tribism thing. Well, of course a European would come here and take charge of these people and improve them and show them how to do things. And he left this thing as a record. And the fascinating thing with Delabar, there's many fascinating things with Delabar, but Delabar was a leading professor of psychology, and his big experimental area was inkblot tests. And he did not appreciate until I think into the 1930s that he was looking at the biggest ink blot he'd ever seen in his life. And he kind of finally acknowledged that a little bit in the end, but he had the scholarly wherewithal to avoid the problems, the traps of what everybody else looked at and saw things that weren't there. He acknowledged those things in his writing very lucidly, that you can look at Dighton Rock and basically see anything you want to see. Well, he looked at it and saw exactly what he wanted to see in the end. And he was also, his experimental area was around self-dosing with hashish, marijuana, and cocaine. And I know from his records he was in another round of those experiments about a week later. So I don't know if any of his visioning had anything to do with the stuff he was taking. But he also became an expert, and an acknowledged expert on rock art. I mean, there was nobody else really doing the work, so he was publishing. And his work is full of that white tribalism kind of too lazy and ignorant to do this stuff. He insisted that Native Americans made no rock art until white people showed up and showed them how to do it. You know, got the tools, and then they kind of imitated it. And he talked about it as meaningless scribbles and careless slashing. He really was not interested at all in what these symbols could possibly mean. So those were, and that interpretation, because it was then seized upon by the Portuguese American community as this evidence of, like the enthusiasm of Scandinavian Americans for dodgy evidence of Vikings, it was, you know, we were here first. You know, we were the founding people, and when you're second-class citizens, this kind of, you know, places you in a more respected state in American culture, especially after, you know, eugenicist reforms to, you know, immigration laws in 1924. So when you go to the museum now, and I was there in May speaking, you still have this very weird experience of going into this building where you're just overwhelmed by all this Portuguese bric-a-brac of ship models, and there's these other theories, but you're led in a narrative way to just think, you know, there's no doubt that this is Miguel Corte Real. And they were very nice to me when I was there, but still, the rock is in the back of the building. It's been pulled out of the water, and the first time I saw it, I felt, I'm not an Indigenous person, but I kind of felt like it was Shamu the killer whale in a concrete tank with no windows or lights, and it just didn't belong here. It had been ripped out of where it had been for thousands of years, where the sun was on it. It was probably important that the tide washed over it twice a day, and now it's this object of Portuguese reverence. So, and it's just a very odd, unsettling thing to see.
Yeah. So you mentioned that people also grabbed a hold of Viking stories with some dodgy evidence, and you wrote a book about one of those stories as well. So could you tell us a little bit about the Beardmore Viking hoax?
The Beardmore came out of, I was actually working on the dissertation, and one of the areas I looked at was, which I ended up dropping, was the Peterborough petroglyphs, because there were theories that, oh no, this is like King Wodelithi of Norway came here and had a trade. It's insane. It just makes no sense at all. So I was looking at that. So there was yet another Viking phenomenon of, you know, misappropriation of indigenous materials. So I was at Trent University, and they said, well, if you're looking at Vikings, you really should be looking at the papers of Jim Curran, who was this newspaper editor that wrote a book called Here Was Vinland, and it was all around the Beardmore relics. And I'd kind of heard of the Beardmore relics at the Royal Ontario Museum, but didn't know a lot about them. And so, again, on the same research, I ended up at the ROM archives, Royal Ontario Museum archives, and started pulling material, and I realized there's this massive amount of stuff just on the Beardmore acquisition. Massive amounts of stuff from the ROM, and then massive amounts of stuff that was donated by Teddy Elliott, a school teacher who was one of the investigators. So Beardmore was a great whodunit hoax with larger applications, you know, as a scholar to look at. And I could talk a bit about what Beardmore is, but what really interested me and permeates the story is this idea of exercise of institutional power and institutional
why don't you tell us a little bit about Beardmore?
So Beardmore, and I've been talking so much about it lately because of the book, and it's like there is no short version, there's a shorter version. but the shortest I can make is that in 1936, there was an itinerant railway guy and prospector named Eddie Dodd in Thunder Bay, Port Arthur, who sold a broken sword, an axe, and something he said was a shield handle that he said he was working his mining claim near Lake Nipigon, blew the dynamite, the dust settled, and there was this stuff in the ground. And Charles Turcarelli, the esteemed director of the ROM Division of Archaeology, was completely electrified by this stuff. He bought it for $500. It's about $7,000 today. He wrote, one of his letters said it was the greatest archaeological find in America, which, if it was real, it really was, because there was no accepted physical evidence for Norse anywhere in North America at the time. We don't get Lasso Meadow until 1960. So he buys the stuff. He hasn't got it on display yet, but by 1938, the case starts to starts to fall apart because other people start to come forward saying, Eddie didn't find this stuff on his mining claim. Eddie found it in the basement of a house that he was renting from a Norwegian immigrant named James Hansen, who got them from another Norwegian immigrant who had given them as loan collateral. And this guy, John Block, defaulted on the loan. Hansen kept the stuff, left them in the basement of this rental house. Eddie Dodd comes along, rents the place, finds the stuff, takes it up to Beardmore, says, leaves it there for a while, then brings me and says, well, look what I just found. So that was the hoax claim. Nobody in Beardmore, almost nobody, ever tells the truth all the time. Some people never tell the truth ever at all. And that applies pretty broadly to most everyone in it, including Charles Triccarelli. So the case is not a very clear and easy, here's the evidence for, and here's the evidence against, here's the victim, here's the perpetrator. It's very hard to tell who the victim and the perpetrator are at some points, because really you get to the point where Charles Triccarelli really becomes the perpetrator. He is invested in this thing. He's going to defend it. He's going to defend it pretty ruthlessly. And he's going to defend it with scholarly allies who are going to throw up roadblocks to anybody that tries to get in the way. There's a tremendous amount of scholarly deference at the time. There isn't a single professional historian or archaeologist working in North America who will publicly cross Charles Triccarelli, will not disagree with him. So he has an enormous amount of cultural, political, professional capital at the peak of his career that he is going to wield, and nobody is going to disagree with him. So it isn't going to fall apart until the mid-1950s when Edmund Carpenter, who was a fairly fearless, self-propelled anthropologist at the University of Toronto. He was American. He was a partner with Marshall McLuhan in media studies, hot new field. He had just reviewed a book about the Piltdown hoax, which had just fallen apart in 1953. That was the so-called missing link in England. After 40-odd years, it was finally proven to be just a cheap fake through scientific study. So Carpenter said, Piltdown's a hoax, and so's this Beardmore stuff, and it's ridiculous. It just needs to go. So it wasn't until 1956, when this case was revived, that key people started coming forward and giving affidavits, and that's when it really fell apart. But by then, 18 years, we had rewritten the history. We really had rewritten the history books. School textbooks for children were telling them, Vikings came to Ontario, and this is where they were, and this is our heritage. And so part of what was interesting to me was, how does that kind of scholarly fraud basically happen? How was it perpetuated for 18 years? How do those alliances work? How was power exercised across those professional networks? And ultimately, today, what are the chances we can have one of those happen again? Because we have had isolated examples in other aspects of history and archaeology where within the academy, things have gone sideways, and people in positions of power have been able to kind of ride roughshod and suppress contrary views.
Yeah, so that's something I'd like you to pick up a little bit more on, because in so many ways you use the Beardmore hoax as a window into exploring and talking about the power of history, the power of academic or intellectual authority to shape our understanding of the world and our place in it. So what do you think either this hoax or other examples tell us about, what stories matter and whose voices count in our collective memory or shared public history?
Well, certainly within Beardmore, it's very class-driven, because somebody like Eddie Dodd, who's this kind of, he wasn't appreciated, kind of a low-grade con man guy, but he was not a very sophisticated man, was barely literate. And part of the defense is for people like Corelli was, Eddie Dodd is not a sophisticated enough guy to pull off something that can fool the likes of the great Charles Triccarelli, who always reminded people he had a severely trained eye and nobody could fool him. He got fooled a lot, actually. There's been a few number of things that the ROM has taken off display over the years that he purchased. I mean, even in 1904, when he was first collecting in Egypt, there's a letter home I have in the book where he writes, one of the people he was collecting for, that he said the fakes outnumber the real stuff 10-1 in the market right now. I mean, it was just, the Mediterranean was awash with stuff, because you had all these private citizens and museums trying to collect things, and you create a demand, and you create a demand that somebody's going to create a supply for it. So a lot of Beardmore is really driven by that idea of the good people up in the top of society and the lowlifes in the bottom, who aren't credible and can't fool Charles. Even though, as I say in the book, I don't think Eddie ever planned to fool. He never had a plan to fool the ROM at all. He just got to the point where he was really out of money, and the word of the relics got to the ROM, and then he just made him an offer he couldn't refuse. And then he wanted to be anonymous, and it would have stayed that way until a leak happened. So that class and power thing was very much happening through it. There's also the issue of the challenge the Academy has around the idea of good faith. That when you have someone of the esteem of Charles Corelli, and this comes up when he starts asking for professional, he starts sending out pictures of the thing to ask the experts, what do you think these are? Because he doesn't have any resources. He doesn't even tell them where he got them. He doesn't even tell them he dug them up in North America, but he tells them it's a Viking grave, and he kind of makes it sound like maybe the museum dug it up. So you have these experts that they're not going to question Charles Corelli on where these things came from. If he says this is a Viking grave, well, then it's a Viking grave. And that's how partly one of the major problems gets overcome, because in weapons typology, the sword just doesn't belong with the axe. They're two different eras. They're never found together in association in Norway in graves, goods. So you have experts doing cartwheels for him saying, well, it must be a really, really, really late example of the sword with a really early example of the axe, and they're in the ground. And that's all we can do for you. And so he can go to the public and say, all the experts agree, they're all of the same date, they're of the same place. So Corelli has that good faith issue, and that is still an issue we deal with in scholarship today, that it comes to this whole grievance thing that just happened with people, filing fake, I'm going to write a fake thing for a journal and see, they just fell for it, they don't check. Well, we do run a lot on good faith. When people say they have this evidence or they're doing this work, we're not doing this intensive, drilling down. And it's how sciences get burned as well. It's how we end up with papers with fake data and they have to be retracted. We operate on that basis. The other thing that came up that I found very tricky to deal with, what interested me, is that when I've dealt with pseudoarchaeology, the classic pseudoarchaeology explanation of the Academy is, and it goes back to Eric von Daniken, is that, well, it's a closed shop. It's a bunch of people protecting their turf. They don't want outsiders. They don't want new ideas. They have, their little minions who are coming up below, the grad students, and they have their journal articles. The journals they sit on. So they don't want these other ideas out there. So they just crush opposition. So that's why my brilliant ideas about why aliens built the pyramids are never accepted by the Academy. So the problem that the Academy has, as with Beardmore, is that every now and then you do get a case like this. It doesn't mean the entire system is corrupt, but you do occasionally get a case. The Mayan glyphs are a great example, where Sir Eric Thompson just basically set back, decades. They lost a generation because he wouldn't accept that there was a phonetic component in Mayan glyphs. And if you tried to bring that forward, you just didn't have a career. And it wasn't until Thompson was gone that in the 1980s they started making progress in that field. That's a notorious example of what can happen in the Academy. So I find myself talking about this, and I'm trying to be kind of supportive to the Academy as an alt-ac person, saying, this is what went wrong with Beardmore. Here's kind of the warning signs. Here's what can happen. But at the same time, I'm very conscious of the fact that in the fringe world, you have to kind of be careful. They're not saying, well, see this Beardmore book? That's just proof. That's just more proof that this went wrong. I gave a talk a couple weeks ago where there was a guy in the audience, and he came to the end, hand goes up, he starts in on grievance literature, he starts in on Solutrean hypothesis, and I just realized, okay, this is where he's going. And I just tried to very quickly shut it down and say, okay, what I'm talking about is things that can happen. I'm not saying there's a systemic, corrupt, academic system. But I think it is important to recognize you can't just, I've had one scholar who had said to me, who's read it, says, see, the system worked. And I said, yeah, but it took 18 years. That's not working very well. I think it works a lot better now. I mean, I did try to deal with it in the conclusion, saying, well, what's different about the academy today? What's different about communication? What's different deference to authority? What are the mechanisms that let us not have a Beardmore now? What are the elements that could let us have a Beardmore now?
Right. Well, I know that the main focus of your books are more of the intellectual, the scholarly pursuit. But you mentioned that there is this popular realm in which these stories have great currency.
Right.
And I'm wondering, why do you think these pseudo-histories, these pseudo-archaeologies persist are so persistent among so many people, and why do they have such a hold on the popular imagination despite the many efforts to debunk them?
There are people that are just absolute true believers. I mean, I was just talking in Thunder Bay this week, and there was an older gentleman that came, and I was told he was coming. He actually told he really liked my book, but he thinks I'm completely wrong. He thinks these are authentic relics, and he was very nice. You know, he came up and he stood up and wanted to make his own speech at the end of the talk, and you just kind of realized he's just not getting this at all. He's just, I mean, you can talk to him, 9 ways to Sunday, and he's still going to think Eddie found stuff in the ground. You cannot move him. And that's an element of the pseudo, is that people are so rigorously fixated that they're just not open to any other interpretation at all. I know over on the archaeology side, people I know, this is where I end up talking most of the time, not on the history side, that people have given this a lot of thought. And I think there is something to, late 19th century sort of demystification of the world, the loss of the sort of the loss of the mystical, the rationalization of the world, and I think there is a yearning in people. I mean, that's how we get into theosophical ideas, and people really are attracted to this otherness, of explanation. It doesn't matter how much you tell them about certain particular things. They want to have these narratives. These narratives are important in their lives, and so it's also partly why when I do talk about it, I really try to avoid, if I can, being mocking about. It's hard not to get mock Eric Von Daniken and space aliens building pyramids, because it also is racist, frankly, because it always says these other cultures, especially indigenous cultures, they're just too stupid, they're too lazy, they couldn't come up with how to move blocks of stone around, or they couldn't make marks in rocks. But people just have this yearning curiosity about things, and sometimes you kind of have to talk them through it, and you hope they kind of come around and maybe progress from it. But I do think there's there's an emptiness of narrative that people fill in their lives with these other exciting things, and it doesn't matter what you tell them. You can't replace it with, okay, well that's kind of Templar Knights in the New World. There's really no evidence, but when I talk about Vikings coming, well then they get excited about Vikings, and the Vikings were in Peterborough or something, or there are these runestones. So I think it's just always going to be there.
Yeah. Now, The Place of Stone came out of your PhD dissertation, which you did here at York, and the research you conducted on the legacy of the Dighton Rock. What was it like to undertake something like a PhD after having written so many books for a popular audience?
Boy, well, first I had no idea what I was getting into. No idea whatsoever. And Carolyn's at fault for that. Because she talked me into doing it. And I had no conception. I had no cohort. I knew some professors and scientists, and I'd written a lot of stuff around science and environment. So, I'm used to interviewing scientists and whatnot. I respect higher knowledge. But I had no idea what a PhD was going to involve. That's another story altogether. I managed to survive it. And it went better than I thought it was going to. But I think when it came down to writing, it ended up just being writing, and you just understand there's a different, you've just got some different criteria. But if you're a working writer, there's lots of different things you write that are different. I've been a financial journalist. I've written long form, short form. Some things you're going to write in the first person. You never would do that somewhere else. Some things are going to be straight up reported. Some of it are going to be experiential. And so it was just a matter of, okay, well, here's my toolkit, and I am used to dealing with, I was used to dealing with primary research. I know how to do that stuff. So what are the objections? Just tell me what the objections, what am I supposed to do in a dissertation? And I will go do it. So probably the biggest difference is, a dissertation needs a really firm, focused thesis statement. Why are you doing this? And a book doesn't necessarily need to do that. If it's purely narrative driven, you're there to tell a story, and it can be of scholarly benefit. I mean, there's books I've written that I know are on reading lists. A book like God's Mercies is still out there on reading lists, but God's Mercies does not have a thesis. It doesn't have an opening statement. It doesn't have any kind of framing structure. It's a story of a convergence of these two people, Hudson and Champlain, and the trauma that happens with them and between people that are with them. So a dissertation is, obviously, as people know, is different. It's like, why are you doing this? What is your point? Make your point, make your argument. And I felt I knew how to make arguments. It was just tell me what the structure is, and then I'll go do that.
Recently you made quite a splash on social media and the historian Twitter with an essay you wrote for Slate magazine. And in that you claim that most academic books aren't written to be read; they're written to be broken. What did you mean?
I first wrote it for my blog, and I like having a blog because I believe if you're going to write, you got to keep going all the time. And if you I get into a research mode, I get itchy if I'm not writing words. So I'm not even sure why I wrote it at the time in July, but it had one of the things that I found experientially that was really difficult for me when I first came into the program is I almost quit the program 3 weeks in because I couldn't figure out how to handle the reading list. Plus, I had a long drive, and it was another issue, but. As I've said, my first week, Canadian history, I think there were 3 books, and one of the books was Children of Atlantic. I owned it. I owned that book, and it's over 600 pages, and if I had never seen that book in my life, I would have said, I got to read this, and these ones, and I got American history, and then I've got my, how do I do this? I can't read all this stuff. And I was trying, but, and I guess I did well enough that after 3 weeks, it was like, no, you're doing fine. You're figuring out how to do this. But I had to learn how to skim really, really aggressively. It's the only way you're going to survive. And so I had a kind of a disquieting relationship with reading and writing that I didn't have before I came into the program. And Karen Wolf, who's at the Alejandro Institute, she actually wrote a really good blog in January about how, she called it gutting. I call it breaking, like ship breaking. She said, how to gut a book. It was written for graduate students. And I emphasize, it's an excellent piece. It lays out, you don't have time to read this thing. Here's how you take a book apart and get to its constituent parts quickly. Just get the gist of the thing out of there, because that's what you're going to have to do to survive. And I know she got a little bit of blowback at the time. It was like showing the Cadbury caramel secret to people that didn't understand. And it's really amazing the number of people I've talked to after the blog and then the Slate version came out that aren't in this realm, who really had no idea that that's how you survive. They really thought, PhD, you must be sitting in a cozy armchair with your pipe and glass of sherry in my book, and I'm just reading these books and becoming erudite. It's like, no, you're freaking hanging on by your fingernails trying to keep up with this massive list. And then for comps, you got about 200 books you're going to have to get through. You're not going to be able to read these books. So the question I had that was occurring to me in July, and what I didn't talk about then, and I'm kind of reluctant to now too, is that by then I'd been through the process of writing 2 books for the academic market. So I'd been through the process. I've been into the guts of the machinery of producing these books. And so the question I was posing to people is that if we have a culture of study in which the only way to effectively survive and keep up with the reading, and it really is necessary, because otherwise your reading list would be nothing. Nobody would actually see any book. You'd have one a week, and what would people absorb in a year? You've got to work with this somehow. But if you have a culture in which the only way you read is by taking books apart and just getting a little bit of a gist of each of them, just enough so I can talk about them, it kind of follows that if that's what the academy is absorbing, then does that mean the books are being written so that's the way the academy can use them? So the structures have to be friendly to that. They have to be written in a way that they can be broken easily. They have to have that kind of introduction and conclusion. They have to have chapters that begin with here's what I'm going to do now, and then there's going to be conclusions as here's what I just did, so that when you come to the point of reading, you can just flip very quickly through and absorb it that way. Because if you don't do it that way, books are really hard to break. They're almost impossible to break. And I really started to think, the books that I've written in the past, I don't think you could break them because I didn't write them to be broken. I kind of had editors who never came to me and said, you better put this together in a way that people won't have to read it. No editor in the trade world will ever tell you that. Will ever say, I know you're going to talk for 100,000 words, but you better have a way that somebody can get the gist of this in an hour, or otherwise we're not going to publish it. So, and I felt myself, I didn't feel good about myself with some of the books I looked at, where I felt I spent the time I needed to on them, but I didn't feel like I really understood them as much as I could have or should have. There were some books that I went back and looked at later and thought, you know, you were a little hard on this book when you first talked about it. You didn't really appreciate what the writer was doing. You talked about it effectively, but you didn't really get the book. So that was my question, was like, what happens when we have a culture that is based around basically book breaking, speed reading, and what is our relationship? I'm going to talk R as the academy and scholarship. If our relationship with books is just, you know, there's this fire hose of new stuff coming out all the time, and I don't have time to deal with it. I just want to get like the gist of this and move on. How does that affect how we write? How does that affect how we communicate? And looking downstream, when we're training a new generation, how do they respond to the idea of how they're supposed to write and read? And it was a very interesting thing to write because, as you said, it was on Slate. Like, I just wrote that thing, I think within 2 hours, it was going all over the frickin' Twitterverse, and it was mainly being driven by early career academics, a number of editors, including my editor Mark Simpson-Voss at UNC Press, were retweeting and sort of, you know, signal boosting it. And a lot of PhD candidates were coming back going, yes, 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 yes. God, I hate doing this. I hate reading this way. And then literally within 2 hours, some editor from Slate was emailing me and saying, could you do a little shorter version of this? Could you touch on a couple other points for me? And so by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd done that version and kind of walked away. And then I just kind of watched it propagate all over the world. And so most of the feedback was really good. Some of it was not good. I mean, at least one, I remember there was I don't want to say which university, it was one of the Ivy League schools, and it wasn't history, but she answered back to me and said, well, exactly. The books have to be written that way, because I am a busy person. I don't have time to read all this stuff. I just want to get the book, I want to look at it quickly, and I need to move on. And if you don't write that book that way, I'm actually kind of angry. I'm not happy with this book. And so as a writer, again, you start to think, if I don't do this book this way that people can kind of get out of really quickly, what are the reviews going to be like? The reviewers are going to be really impatient with me because I didn't do it, because they're busy people. I don't have time to read this whole book. I just want to get the gist of the book. The other thing that came out that I thought was, I started to think about more, was interesting, because I hear a lot from early career academics. They contact me and they want to know advice on publishing and writing, and you know, I try to be helpful. And Mark Simpson-Voss, my editor at UNC Press, was also started this kind of informal tweet poll, not a poll, but he was asking early career, because he was asking people, early career especially, what is your experience at the peer review stage? Is it the peer review experience that is driving you to write like this? It's not the editor that's saying, I want this kind of book. It's they get to the peer review, and the peer review is saying, you know, this is, you know, I know you maybe want to write this with narrative, or you want to do it this way, but this is not working. You got to change it. And what I kept hearing from, what I started to see was kind of a schism between early career and established academics. I mean, even places like Basic Books, there was a conference recently where the editor was talking, and they just flat out said, we really like to work with tenured profs, because the tenured profs are secure. There's not a file they're trying to put together. They have the freedom to write the way they want. You know, and we can get a book from them, and we can cross over it. We can sell it to the general public, but we can get it on reading lists. Early career academics are under an enormous amount of pressure to just do the job that they're told to do. They may hate what's coming out of the process. They may not be happy with it, but they are really conscious of this is part of the process of getting the job. This is the part of the process of getting it in the file. And I am not ready to make waves about the way I do things. I'm not going to stand up and disagree with the review process and what I'm being told. I'm just going to do it. So I think that's, I mean, I'm harmless. I'm a guy living in the woods. I'm not in a, I'm not in a department. I mean, I'm now starting to have, academic presses come to me and pay me to review, to assess manuscripts for publishability kind of thing. But this is really something the Academy itself, I think, needs to talk about and discuss. The one thing I did find is that I talked about narrative as a device because I use it tremendously, and I don't think the Academy understands what narrative is and how it's employed. There's definitely a hostility to it. There's definitely misunderstanding. Some of the negative feedback was around the kind of, I think people really thought, in fact, one was basically saying, oh, well, he says we have to write with beautiful prose and the largest possible audience. And I was like, no, that's not what I said at all. I don't even know what beautiful prose is or words are, and there is no largest possible audience. There isn't even a largest possible audience in the trade market. Everybody has a niche market. So even when you're going for something in a crossover, and if you're a trade writer and your agent's pitching a book for you, every pitch you make is going to be, who is your perceived audience? If you write every possible person in the world, the acquisition editor is going to throw it in your face and go, no, really, who is your audience? There's always an audience. There's always a niche, and who are you expecting to talk to? So when I talk about narrative, I'm not talking about inventing dialogue, and I'm not talking about novelistic techniques. To me, narrative has always been basically people in motion through space and time. I think that's what I would boil it down to. And that is a device you use to move yourself through the material, move the reader through the material. And I think it's not just a device or an approach, it actually is a really effective way to drive research. Because it compels you to learn things in order to take that path that otherwise in your outline you're just never going to get to. And so it's not the only way to do things, because people would say, oh, well, does everything have to be the way? No, absolutely not. We don't have to do all the books that way. There's no way to do it. But if you say to me, well, what I'm doing, there's just no possible way to use narrative, even in an episodic way, I'm a bit, oh, really? You have no people? You have no situations? You have no movement through time and space? What is it that's so special about what you're doing? Because, I mean, I'll fight like a bastard to get the material I need to write narrative, and it can take a lot of digging. And narrative is really fuel intensive for evidence. You need to know so much stuff to put people in motion. Even something like the opening paragraph in Beardmore, just even to say the words steam locomotive and hard benches on the day coach. I mean, there's like a half a dozen words in there that took a lot of work just to say, here's what's happening on that train on that night in July 1934 that gets you into the story. Yeah. So there's a very long answer to what happened there.
That's great. And it reminds me of the opening scene of my first book, where it's something like the trees, there's frost on the trees, and it's the air was filled with the smell of bacon and coffee. And in order to actually document that, you have to go to the newspaper, see what the weather was that day, go to journals to see did the soldiers light fires that morning to cook their meal, and then you can say that.
Right. Yeah, and it will drive you to learn things and understand things. Otherwise, in an outline, you're just not going to do. Yeah. And I'm a really big believer in microbiography. I mean, I've blogged about that as well. I really like to drill down into the lives of every single person I'm working on, even if it's only going to be a sentence or two in the end. I really want to know who they are, who do they know, what is their life. I mean, I do believe history functions through lives lived and experienced. Yeah. So that's the kind of material. I mean, I'm just dealing with A.Y. Jackson right now as a war artist and a soldier in the First World War for McGill, Queens. And, to tell Jackson's war experience, what I have to do is I have to go into the 60th Battalion and I have to go through 1,200 records. I have to find a company. I'm now up to the letter P, and it's taken me a month. I have to get every biography of those guys and then do a spreadsheet of how old they were, when did they enlist, when were they wounded, were they killed in action, anything salient about they were 5'3", they were a train, what was their class. I mean, those are the things that then allow you to drive the narrative. Then you've got an experience of war and the battle. And to get to that point, it takes just huge and huge amounts of work. So it's not a case within the academy. The academy say, oh, well, you want to write narrative. You know, you want to skip the hard stuff and just tell stories. And it's like, no, to tell the stories takes a tremendous amount of work to get to the point where you know enough that if you even have a story to tell. So.
Oh. Well, that's really, I think, a great place to end on. That, you know, we need to find ways to. I always think that in telling stories, people are good to think with.
Yeah.
And they're good to tell larger stories when you can embody that larger story in a single individual. You've written two wonderful books, and I would recommend that everyone get a copy. Buy 2 copies if get one to a friend or family for the holidays. And congratulations on that. Thank you so very much.
Thanks
for joining us.
for having me.